I am pleased to introduce, actually, national hero, not heroine, but hero of Canada's Walk of Fame, 2023 hero. And that's one of many awards. Catherine Abreu is an award-winning activist. Now that's an unusual thing, because a lot of people don't like activists, you know. And I have to say that it's also listed in her bio. You'll see the stuff in the bio, which everybody should read, but it's also listed that she's a diplomat, and I think that's the secret. She actually tells the truth, but she does it in a nice way. So, I'm so pleased she's willing to come and talk to us today. It's been a very crazy week for her, like Sephora, being in New York, being in Montreal for the Climate Action Network, et cetera, that we are very, very lucky to have her here. And she's going to tell us even more about citizen participation, how important it is. I was telling her that that's a theme that has been coming out in our presentations, thank goodness, because that was the theme of the conference. And she is a leader, an international leader, in the NGO happenings on the international stage. So over to you, Kat.
This guy on? Huh? No. Okay. Great. Oh, this one's good? Awesome. Hi, everyone. Oh, wow. It's actually so rare that I say hi, everyone, and get a chorus of response from the crowd. That's really nice. Thank you. That's energizing. I was just telling Susan I'm so exhausted. I wish I had been here. I had planned to be here for a part of your session this morning, and I just couldn't make it. I had to sleep in. So, and appreciate your patience. I know we're starting the session a little bit later so that I could eat some of the delicious food that was here. So thank you for nourishing me and welcoming me. So yeah, I was just catching up with Susan about the conversations that you've been having about the importance of citizen engagement, really in every space. Like I often say, you can be a climate activist everywhere, like wherever you work, wherever you spend your time, whatever community you spend time in, you can be a climate activist, even if you're not like a paid member of a non-governmental organization like I am. I'm going to talk about what that looks like in the international space and the kind of feedback loop between international and domestic climate politics. I thought I would be provocative by asking this question of should climate activists engage in international climate politics. I was overhearing a conversation, hope you don't mind that I was overhearing you, asking like, how do you call yourself a climate activist if you're not engaging in the international politics? But the truth is, and we'll go through this in my presentation, that there's understandably some cynicism toward the international climate regime. And I actually experience that a lot of folks in the spaces that I operate in are asking this question. Does it make sense for us to be engaging in the international space? So I thought I would start off by asking that question and then aim to kind of answer why I think the international space is a really important place for us to engage, and tell you some stories about some of the big changes that I've been a part of making by engaging in both the domestic and international realms of climate politics. A couple of you were at the climate convergence yesterday in Montreal, looking at you, Ken, and may have seen parts of this presentation before. Forgive me, but hopefully I'll still be engaging when I tell the story. Okay, another thing to say, I just started a new job. So I was for a few years there running my own small nonprofit, Destination Zero. I've just now started as the director of a global network of organizations operating in the climate diplomacy multilateral space called the International Climate Politics Hub. So that's me. But I continue to be plugged into the work in Canada through being a member of the Net Zero Advisory Body and on the board of Climate Action Network Canada. All right, 1988. We saw the establishment of the of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change by the World Meteorological Organization and the UN Environment Program. This is, in that same year, a picture of James Hansen testifying to the US Senate on human-induced global warming. This was the big wake-up call moment for climate, right, for the world. And it was kind of incredible that very shortly after this wake-up call being issued to global governments, all the global governments got together and they were like, okay, we should do something about this and create a forum where we can come together regularly to talk about climate change. Synthesize climate science, which is what the IPCC does. It brings all climate scientists of the world together to kind of go through the research, synthesize the outcomes of that research, and present it in their synthesis reports. That's one of the big things that the IPCC produces. And it was kind of unprecedented that all of the countries in the world come together in this way to take collective action on a particular issue. But it wasn't a recent discovery that the global temperature was changing due to the combustion of fossil fuels. In fact, we've known that since the mid-19th century, right? Like, this science has been available to us since the 1850s, when the warming effect was first observed, since the late 19th century, when the connection between the growth in the production and combustion of fossil fuels was made to this warming trend. And so it's surprising, for that reason, that when we finally got around to creating the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which happened in 1992, a few years after the creation of the IPCC, that it didn't actually name the cause of the climate crisis, right? Nowhere in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change does it mention fossil fuels, even though we've had this science for a long time. And there's a reason for that. In the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and you guys talked to Zep yesterday, I know, so maybe she said a little bit of this. Who was doing all of the good research on climate change? It was the fossil fuel industry. And they were pretty shocked by what they figured out, and they worked for decades in a well-resourced, coordinated way to influence the public dialogue and politics around climate change, to bury the fact that climate change is caused by the production and combustion of fossil fuels. And so we wound up with this unprecedented coming together of countries to take action on an issue, and yet the cause of that issue wasn't directly named. This is quite different from a later example that we had of all the countries in the world coming together to take action on an environmental issue under the Montreal Protocol, which of course is the international treaty that deals with the chemicals that cause the injury to the ozone layer. In that treaty, the cause of that environmental harm is actually directly named, and the treaty is about global cooperation on how to phase those chemicals out. Guess what's happening to the hole in the ozone layer? It's closing up. It's healed much faster than we thought it was going to. And so we have a working example of the difference that a treaty can make when it actually names the cause of the crisis and coordinates action to eliminate that cause. That being said, can you name any manufacturers of hydrofluorocarbon molecules, like the chemicals that were causing the hole in the ozone? No. Can you name a fossil fuel company? Yes. And so the power and influence of the fossil fuel industry has been very present in these processes since the very beginning. And this is where it leaves us. Despite 30 years of international climate negotiations, we are perilously close to eating up the whole global carbon budget for remaining below 1.5 degrees of warming. And of course, we all know that the last couple of years have been not only the warmest years on record, but scientists are telling us probably the warmest years in the last many thousands of years, maybe up to 10,000 years. And we have seen an average of global temperatures being around 1.5, even 1.6 degrees above pre-industrial levels in the last couple of years. So while we haven't officially breached that 1.5 threshold, because that's an averaging that we'd have to observe for a much longer period than a couple of years, we're starting to see and feel what it is like to live in a world that is warmed by that significant a degree. This is what it looks like in Canada. So I keep using the word average. That means that some parts of the world are warming faster, some parts of the world are warming slower. We here in Canada live in a part of the world that's warming much faster. The majority of Canada has been warming about twice the rate of the global average, and in the far north of what we now call Canada, that warming trend has been observed at about 3 times the global average. And so while I think in this part of the world we have often observed climate impacts as something that happens somewhere else, it's been happening here in an accelerated way that we've perhaps been normalizing, as humans do. But I think at this point, all of us have stories about the impacts that we and our community members are experiencing from climate change across the country. And so, you know, it's fair to ask the question, like, what have those negotiations been doing if emissions are higher than ever, and if the warming that we're experiencing is worse than ever, and if 10 years ago, 80% of the global energy mix and 86% of carbon dioxide emissions were coming from 3 products, oil, gas, and coal, and that is still the case a decade later, right? Even though we have seen exponential growth in renewable energy over the course of that decade, it has not worked that well to displace fossil fuel-based energy. Why? Because the policies have not been in place to make sure that those renewables are being used to actually eliminate fossil fuels. So what's been going on? Well, again, going back to the tremendous power and influence of the fossil fuel industry, they just are constantly looking for ways to justify and expand their ongoing production. A couple of years ago, as we were on our way to the 27th Conference of Parties, that's what COP stands for, to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, a report was released from Oil Change International that told us about the expansion plans that the majority of oil and gas companies around the world have to continue pumping out oil and gas and coal well beyond the thresholds that will make the possibility of limiting warming to 1.5 or even 2 degrees Celsius pretty impossible. We have also been hearing in the last couple of years the extent to which the renewable energy industry is, you know, pushing back against this unlevel playing field that they have been put on, where the investments that are being made in fossil fuels, at least until recently, were continuing to outstrip investment in renewables, and where the policies in place around energy were very much favoring the incumbent industry of fossil fuels rather than renewable energy. And so again in 2022, IRENA, the International Renewable Energy something. My acronym unpacker isn't working so well this morning. Made this call of, you know, saying we need a fundamental shift in the ways in which the energy sector is being invested in, and we need policy change to make that happen. And here's the other reason that I hear a lot of cynicism around the international climate regime. It's because fossil fuel lobbyists show up to COP in huge numbers, which is enraging. And we have only been seeing that getting worse in the last couple of years. So this is analysis from last year's COP28 in Dubai, where Amnesty International, made the analogy of saying it's as if we were having a global conference on peace and we're inviting all the arms dealers to come to that conference. So, this is where the kind of cynicism around the international regime comes from, and it's well-founded, and it's very important that we're asking these questions of what is it that this process has been doing, can do, given the state of the world that we see ourselves in 30 years after its establishment. Well, here's what we did about it. When I say we, I mean a huge global movement, and I know, again, you heard a little bit about the diversity of that movement yesterday from Zipporah, came together in the last few years, and I had the privilege of helping to coordinate some of those efforts through the various networks that I get to engage with in the international space, to shift the diplomatic arena from one where the prioritization was really to extract increasingly stringent targets from governments, but to never really follow up and ask, are you meeting those targets? To an international system that is about implementation, and to diplomatic interventions and strategies that are about making sure that governments actually implement the promises that they are making on the international stage. And of course, the very first place that we needed to focus was on the implementation of the energy transition. So last year, in 2023, this kind of years-long push that I would say happened over the course of around, the Lofoten Declaration, which was a global declaration from civil society groups saying, we're going to put our focus on fossil fuels, we need to phase out fossil fuels. That happened in 2017. So we can say that, it's been around the last 6 to 7 years that this global movement has happened. It culminated last year publicly in the global march to end fossil fuels, and these are some images from that. And at the same time, the UN Secretary General hosted a climate summit last year in 2023, September, New York Climate Week, where he directly asked leaders to come with their plans to transition away from fossil fuels. It's painful to see how long it took, but it's also remarkable to see how quickly, relative to the slow pace of this international regime, we were able to make this change and to finally hear, ringing through the halls of the UN, climate change is about fossil fuels. It's unbelievable that that is a significant achievement. We have to acknowledge that, but we also have to acknowledge what a game-changing achievement it is to finally have forced this conversation into the UN conversations around climate change. And that only continues through many other multilateral spaces. So these are pictures of me participating in a high-level summit that the International Energy Agency, the IEA, put on last year, building on their roadmap to net zero, which was the first time, again, that the IEA came out very strongly saying, in order for us to deliver on our climate promises, we need to be focusing on the transition out of fossil fuels toward renewable energy and energy efficiency. And that, again, was hugely significant because the IEA, for the bulk of its existence, was really about how to paint a rosy picture of the fossil fuel industry. Don't tell them I said that. But actually what I often say is that the IEA is still, in some regards, telling us the best case scenario for the fossil fuel industry. And it actually just so happens that the best case scenario at this point for the fossil fuel industry is a managed decline of that industry, which is what the IEA is now trying to map. So, last year was this incredible year of these diplomatic multilateral institutions finally absorbing the cause of the climate crisis into their conversations around climate change, it was also a remarkable year for civil society of every stripe around the world pushing those conversations into public spaces in the international arena. This picture on the left is from the UN, the mid-year UN climate negotiations that happened in Bonn, Germany in June. Not normally a space where you see banner drops. And it was kind of incredible to be seeing, you know, I think the first banner drop I had ever witnessed in 10 years of going to those negotiations. And this is what it read. It read, "End fossil fuels." A few months later, we were in Dubai, a set of talks hosted by the head of the UAE's national oil company, by the way. But all of the civil society presence in those talks were centered around this loud and vocal call to end the fossil fuel era. And you see this message, "Hold the line." This was literally a line of civil society participants within the negotiations in Dubai who stood in line for hours as the negotiators went into their negotiating rooms just to tell them, like, you have to hold the line on fossil fuels. Like, I'm getting goosebumps thinking about it. It was amazing. I just need to share more pictures from it because it was so, it was so wonderful to see. An interesting dynamic, actually. So in the last few years, the COPs have been hosted in in countries with authoritarian regimes, which has meant that we haven't been able to protest outside of the COPs in the ways that we normally would be able to. And so it's actually brought the protests inside the COPs, which is really cool, actually. I hear my colleagues kind of complaining about it a lot, and I'm looking forward to going to Brazil next year in 2026 when we'll be able to protest on the inside and the outside. But it has been amazing to see the level of mobilizations actually inside the negotiating space. So yeah, once again, just some powerful images. The other thing that's been happening in COP spaces recently is something called the People's Assembly. So Climate Action Network International said, well, we're going to start taking over the main negotiating room for one of the days of the COP so that we can have the conversation that the people are having on the ground, which has also been a really beautiful and powerful innovation, I would say, a civil society innovation in the negotiations. And we did it. We got the F words into the text. We got fossil fuels into the text. And it was a milestone achievement. And these are just some glimpses into the civil society negotiation spaces that we had to bring this huge cross-network coalition of groups together and make sure that we were coordinated on our messaging, coordinated on the things we were whispering to our negotiators and our diplomats. And we were coordinated in the messaging that we were giving to media, and that's a picture of a couple of us just in the center of insane media scrums trying to explain the various iterations of text that were coming out. At some point, we had this wild experience of OPEC writing a letter to the negotiators, like warning them that the climate change treaty was about to name the cause of climate crisis, and like compelling them to take action. You know you're doing something right when OPEC writes a letter. So it was incredible to just be part of that huge escalation. And on the final morning of the COP, after no sleep, you can see the sun coming up, and my colleague Romain and I and a number of our friends are just furiously looking at the new text that came out overnight and trying to analyze it. And finally, the COP president, the head of the UAE, National Oil Company, gavelled through an agreement that says, we are going to transition away from fossil fuels, we're going to triple renewable energy, we're going to double energy efficiency. And that's what that text looks like. Don't read this whole thing, it's really boring. But it is really significant, and it's imperfect. So this is the other thing to acknowledge. Like, There is no clear, it's difficult when you're working on climate change for there to be a clear 100% win. And this wasn't one of them. This was not a clear 100% win. It includes a bunch of options around transition fuels, which we all know is code for gas. It also leaves a bunch of unhelpful space for dangerous distractions, what some might call false solutions, like carbon capture and storage, offsetting. So there's still a ton of work cut out for us. This was just the kind of wedge in the doorframe for us to push this conversation around energy transition into the climate negotiations. Oop, wrong button. And we got another win, which is that as of COP28, not just fossil fuel lobbyists, all lobbyists have to disclose their interests before getting accredited to the COP. Again, not a perfect win, because many of those lobbyists are actually accredited by countries, like Canada, who do bring a bunch of civil society, like me, to COPs, which I appreciate. They also bring a bunch of fossil fuel lobbyists. And it's much harder for the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC Secretariat, to control the badges that parties are giving out to COPs. But they've at least said, you know, for the badges we have control over, we're going to ask that you disclose, and your disclosure will be included in our consideration of whether you're allowed into the talks. So this is kind of like lesson number one, for me, from my perspective, which is that the UNFCCC and COP space is the only process in the world that brings every country in the world together to do something. And it just so happens that what they're coming together to do is act on climate change. And all of these things are true at the same time. The process is deeply flawed. It's also critical and unparalleled. If we didn't have this process, we'd have to just create it all over again. And we can change it. It's not easy, but we can change it. We are changing it. And the only way we can do that is by showing up. So here's where we are now in the international realm. We are in a space of talking about the next iteration of countries' climate plans. In UNFCCC lingo, these are called NDCs, nationally determined contributions, because they are plans that national governments make. We're also in a huge push for a new global climate finance goal. How many of you have heard about the $100 billion goal? Yeah, a few, okay. So that was an agreement made in 2009 in Copenhagen, which was a set of climate talks that completely fell apart. It was disastrous. That was when I was first coming into the climate work, and like all the climate activists were so depressed. It was a funny time to come into the work. But the one thing that was kind of salvaged from the wreckage of the Copenhagen climate talks was this $100 billion pledge from developed countries to pay for developing countries to take action on climate change, respond to climate impacts. Now, you know, close to 15 years later, they're negotiating a new climate finance pledge in the talks. And every country in the world has to figure out, okay, what's the climate plan that we're going to submit to the UN. The official deadline is February 10th, 2025. You can imagine most countries are not on track to meet that deadline. And what are we going to contribute to the climate finance pledge conversations? I will say Canada is one of the few countries that is on track to deliver our climate plan on time, because we have a law about it. And I have a whole speech about the fact that we need to have climate laws everywhere in order to compel like regular, predictable action on climate planning. But that's besides the point. The level of ambition that our new climate plan will reach is probably not going to be as high as it needs to be. We can say that pretty confidently. But I thought I would give you, this is, we're now going into storytelling time. I thought I would give you a little bit of insight into a few years ago when Canada updated its existing NDC. So current NDCs take us to 2030. This new round would take us to 2035. And when the Trudeau government came in 2015, they adopted the Harper NDC, which included a goal to reduce Canada's emissions 30% below 2005 levels by 2030. And obviously, we were like, you guys are going to improve on that, right? Like, you're going to make that a better commitment, right? And they didn't do it for many years. And it took a very well-coordinated and consistent drumbeat of pressure from Canadian civil society for the Trudeau government to adopt a new and more ambitious climate target in its existing NDC. In 2019, we at Climate Action Network Canada, I was the director at that point, released this infographic on what Canada's fair share of the global effort to reduce climate pollution is. So we had our recommendation of what Canada's 2030 climate pledge should be, which is a reduction of 60% in emissions, and a huge escalation in Canada's climate finance for us to account for the impacts that Canada is responsible for already as being one of the top 10 global emitters, now top 12, because our emissions are going down, good news story, but incrementally. And definitely is one of the world's highest per capita emitters. We have a huge historic and contemporary responsibility for the crisis, and we're a rich country, so we should be paying up for those damages. Finally, in 2021, after these coordinated pushes for more ambition, more money, Trudeau did announce the new 2030 target of reducing emissions in Canada 40 to 45% below 2005 levels by 2030, and doubled Canada's international climate finance. So again, not at the level of ambition that we need to be seeing from Canada. However, a really significant change that happened because of the coordinated efforts of Canadian civil society. And so basically what I'm saying is, like, we need to do that again, because Canada needs to be submitting a new NDC that is more ambitious and needs to be upping the ante when it comes to international climate financing. So a few stories about pushing for ambition using this international domestic feedback loop. And some some lessons that I've kind of drawn out of my experience of these stories. In 2016, I was in Marrakesh, Morocco, for COP22, COP22, and something else happened while we were there, which is that Trump was elected president. It sucked and was extremely painful. We were just like openly weeping in the halls, in the negotiating tents in Marrakesh. This is Ban Ki-moon, the UN Secretary General at the time, who, you know, really made it clear climate change action is unstoppable. But there was this kind of gap, this diplomatic gap that was left by the exit of the US. Not that the US has been super helpful in the climate talks, they really haven't, but they're a global power, and in particular, the US was fairly influential in the dynamic with China about what China was kind of willing to bring to the table in the international climate talks. So there was this huge vacuum, and people were like, well, who's going to fill that vacuum? And Canada stepped up to help fill that vacuum, partnered with the EU and China as a kind of relationship broker between the EU and China to form something called the Ministerial on Climate Action, which they've now been using for many years as a meeting space for global ministers to come together and discuss climate action in a way that doesn't rely on the diplomatic power of the US, because they've become just so unreliable. And these are, pictures of Catherine McKenna, who was the Environment and Climate Change Minister at the time, with her counterparts from the EU and China. It was a significant way in which the global community, I think, was given some confidence that there would still be kind of diplomatic coordination happening with some countries playing, and Canada played a really key role in that. And by the way, they did that with in large part because of the conversations that folks like us were having with them. Another thing that happened in 2017, a year later, is 2018, a couple years later, was the IPCC negotiations to land the special report on 1.5 degrees. Who's heard of that report? Okay. So in the Paris Agreement, it was actually really significant to get this line around holding warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, because previously the temperature threshold had been articulated at 2 degrees. Imagine 2 degrees of warming. It's disastrous. So this was the report that really hammered that home as the new normal for the temperature threshold. It changed the world. And it probably wouldn't have happened without some key interventions from key countries, including Canada. This is a picture of me with my colleagues who were on the ground in Incheon, South Korea, where we landed that report, and we stayed up for nights. For the last few days of the negotiations were totally sleepless nights for the negotiators, and Canada really did play a pivotal role in getting that report across the line. Again, and they might not have played that role had civil society not been there in Incheon to nudge them in that direction. So lesson number one from my perspective, Canada does sometimes play an important climate leadership role in the international space, and we as civil society can and we do shape and leverage that. So Canada is sometimes playing a useful role in climate conversations internationally, and it's up to us to make sure that they do that in the places where we think they have the potential to. A couple more stories. So again, taking us back to 2017, Climate Action Network Canada members, in particular Labour members, were telling us about their push for Canada to adopt some significant policies around just transition in the context of the decision to accelerate the phase out of coal power. And Labour leaders were really frustrated that they weren't actually really getting the ear of the government on the issue of just transition for coal power workers and communities. And so we as Climate Action Network Canada said, okay, we're going to make this the #1 focus for us when we go to COP. Which I think is a beautiful story about, an intersectional approach and how we work to raise the priorities of our partners in these spaces. And so, yeah, we went to COP. We had all these position papers going into it. We did a panel at COP. There was one brave Canadian journalist at that COP, Mike D'Souza at the National Observer at the time, who did incredible reporting of all of these events and the, statements that labor union leaders were making at the COP toward the Canadian government. Catherine McKenna was at the time launching the Powering Past Coal Alliance. So she was looking to get international credit for the moves Canada was making on coal phase out, and bringing an international coalition of governments who were also making those moves together. And we made it so that we were basically like, you're not going to get that credit unless you have something to say about just transition. And she did. She announced at that COP a Just Transition Task Force, which was the first time. It wasn't the first Just Transition Task Force in the world, but it was the first government-announced Just Transition Task Force in the world. And so it was quite precedent-setting, and it really made this link between, okay, if we're going to say we're accelerating the transition in a particular sector, we need to be thinking about just transition alongside of it. We got home, the Just Transition Task Force was set up. The Canadian Labour Congress and the Conservation Council of New Brunswick, proud to say 2 Climate Action Network Canada members, co-chaired that task force. They went to every region across the country that would be affected by this transition. They talked to the people on the ground, and they issued an incredible report that's still relevant today, really raising up those voices and saying these are what these communities need in order to adopt to this transition. And the beautiful thing about it, from my perspective, was that it really reflected the conversations that civil society organizations and communities across the country were having in a very local way. So I was seeing Climate Action Network Canada members talk about just transition in their communities, release these beautiful reports, and then I was seeing that taken up in the national context by the Just Transition Task Force that we landed because of our international advocacy and activism. So this brings me to lesson number 2, which is that we can and we do make use of the international space to amplify our domestic work and land outcomes that can scale what's happening at the domestic and local and community level into international leadership. All right, my last story. This one's much more recent. It's from last year. So at the beginning, I was telling you about this unprecedented experience last year of coming to the UN Secretary General's Climate Action Summit and seeing, wow, like, we're talking about fossil fuels as the cause of the climate crisis. And in fact, the largest expanders of fossil fuels weren't even invited to the UN Secretary General's summit because he was like, I don't trust you. Except for Canada. Canada got an invite because we're so nice. And you know, I think fair to say Canadian civil society was quite concerned about that. We were like, we don't want Canada's reputation to be greenwashed when you've excluded, as Canada is the second largest planned expander of fossil fuels, you've excluded the other 4. We're in the top 5, you've excluded the other 4. Why are you letting Canada in? Wouldn't it be great if you could ask about this disconnect between Canada's climate plans and our fossil fuel expansion? And guess what they did? The Undersecretary General for the UN asked Trudeau, the leader of Canada, in this summit, what are you planning to do about your fossil fuel expansion and the fact that this is going to contradict your climate ambition? It was a huge moment that really echoed back, I would say, into the Canadian media pretty strongly. And he was really caught off guard. And the response was, at COP28, they announced, finally, their framework for an emissions cap on oil and gas, which they had promised years prior and really not made any progress on. And I think it was really this moment where the perspective of civil society saying, hey, we need to be calling out the disconnect between Canada's climate action plans and its expansion of fossil fuels. I think if that had not happened in September 2023, we would not have gone to Dubai in November 2023 wearing our emissions caps and starting an international fashion craze and gotten this framework from the government. So, final lesson, the international arena is a really powerful space to build pressure on Canada to land outcomes that might not happen otherwise. So those are some of my observations and learnings from my work in the international sphere about how we can leverage the international work to push the domestic ambition and how we can use the international space to reflect some of the cool work that's happening domestically here in Canada. Hopefully it was really useful, and yeah, look forward to your questions. Do you need this mic? Okay. Sorry.
I thank you very
Yes,
much.
love that.
We've got 1,000 of them to distribute.
Oh, sweet. You all get you get an emissions cap. You get an emissions cap.
That's it. I don't have them here today, unfortunately. Thank you very much. That was a really, really informative presentation. I took tons of notes.
Great.
I do want to highlight an effort that my group is making, Seniors for Climate Action. Thanks to an environmental defense presentation by Ali Rougeau, who was at COP28. She lit a fire under some of us, and SCAN, Seniors for Climate Action Now, started a COP29 campaign. And we produced 2,000 postcards to send to Guilbeault saying no fossil fuel representatives at COP29.
Amazing. I didn't know about that. Cool.
Well, I saw him last Thursday, and I had a chance to give him hell for not responding to even one of them. Yeah. And he said, oh, well, we get so many. So I confronted him and said, why did you allow so many to go? 8 one year and then 28 the year after. Oh, well, they were all from Alberta. What can I do? We live in a democratic country. We can't stop Alberta from doing what they want. And I doubt that's true. I think he could have said no to them.
Yeah.
Don't you?
Oh, yes, absolutely. They can say no. And it would have been really politically challenging.
Yes.
And we have to ask, I think it's so fair to say, we're asking you to do something really politically challenging and you got to do it.
Yeah. Well,
that's what you got to do.
So do you know how many are going from fossil fuel?
To COP29?
Yeah.
Oh, I have no idea. We never know that until afterward, and we get to see who actually went.
Right.
I mean, it's so cool to know about your initiative. I did not know that. I would love a postcard.
There's only one left.
Okay. I'll settle for a picture of a postcard.
Okay.
It is, however, the case that I think, directing those campaigns toward the federal government absolutely makes sense, and it might make sense to also direct it toward the provincial government. Because it is true that Alberta, Daniel Smith showed up to COP28.
Yeah.
It was
With a pavilion, an Alberta pavilion.
An Alberta pavilion, and Saskatchewan had all their greenwashing ads all over the Dubai subway.
Right.
It was awful. And for Daniel Smith to show up at a climate conference with the explicit plan to sign oil and gas deals there, which she did, is disgusting. So I think we also need to put the pressure and the heat on Alberta for their behavior.
Right. I wanted to highlight, too, the second part of our campaign. We got CANRAC to give 2 webinars as well, and then we got our members to listen to 3 CANRAC webinars. So our members are pretty well educated on climate, on COPs.
Nice.
We have, Ken, you have the only document that we produce. Could you give our copy to Catherine, and I promise I'll give you more on Tuesday. I have hundreds more. This is a document we produced to kind of educate the public about why we should care about COP and what Canada needs to do at COP and how Canadians can make sure our government is doing it. So
I love that.
So I'd like you to have a copy. That's it. Give it to her right now before you sneak away with it.
Thank you.
So I had some yesterday,
That's awesome.
but I've run out. You
Oh,
can
I
go
love
to the
this.
Seniors for Climate Action Now website. On the home page, we have a COP29 section that has that document. You can print it out, and lots of resources references that back up the information there.
Yes, I love
So
that it's a
thank
payoff
Ali
campaign.
Rougeau of Environmental Defense for
Sweet.
lighting the fire.
Any other questions? Comments?
Roy's got one.
Thanks. Fantastic presentation. I wanted to ask a question about financing. Are we doing enough to stop the flow of financing to the fossil fuel sector, particularly but not exclusively from the banks, from all of those pooled funds that we call retirement funds or pension funds? Can we not do more to stop fossil fuel expansion by cutting off its finance source?
Yes, 100%.
How?
So Shift, have you guys heard of Shift Action? Yes, you guys know Shift, great. So Shift has some really amazing campaign materials online that you can use to both find out how deeply your pension is invested in fossil fuels. And I think they've got really amazing templates that you can use as a shareholder in your pension to put pressure on them. Organizing does work for pensions. We've actually seen some movement in some pensions in Canada already, although not enough. The banks in Canada are some of the most deeply invested in fossil fuels. I actually sometimes think to myself that the thing that's keeping Canada really stuck in fossil fuels is not our domestic fossil fuel industry, it's our banks. Because our banks are so overly leveraged on fossil fuels that it would create some significant economic instability for Canada were those investments to suddenly be worthless. So those campaigns, there are many that I know you can easily find. I'm sure many of you are plugged into them already. But I think sometimes in our advocacy around banks and pensions, we can lose track of the fact that government regulation has a huge role to play. We sometimes lean heavily on, private sector entities doing the right thing out of the goodness of their hearts, or as a response to public pressure, which I know RBC, for instance, has been really hearing, and they've been hosting conversations about it. And doing, kind of some changes around the margins, and at least kind of talking about their investments in fossil fuels more transparently. But there's only so much that RBC is going to do on its own, particularly when they have to be asking the question, like, okay, well, if I do this, what's my competitor going to do? And if we're not all moving at the same time, what does that mean? And the thing that forces them all to move at the same time is government regulation. And government regulation on greening the financial sector is I mean, I was going to say it's hugely behind, but it's like non-existent, actually. And there has been an effort, the Sustainable Finance Coalition that was struck by the government made a series of recommendations, including a green taxonomy for Canada to create new investment flows into green things. And guess what? That green taxonomy has not been put in place in the time since SFAC, this Sustainable Finance Coalition, came together to make these recommendations. Australia struck their own. We're like, Canada, what are you doing? Interesting, we are learning from that. We've developed our green taxonomy and put it in place in the time that Canada has been like dithering and not putting it in place. Which is just sad, and I think a huge part of that is because the LNG industry wanted a green stamp from the green taxonomy, and they don't get it because they're fossil fuels, and they're mad, and they've stalled it from getting put in place. That's my read. So while direct action toward banks and pensions is really critical, we also need to be directing our advocacy around these issues to the government to say, we expect you to put regulations in place to green our financial sector, to make our financial sector more resilient to the volatility in the world around energy markets, and to create a level playing field. Do you have a question as well? Oh, okay, great.
But I've been getting some looks that say that I'm going to have to cut it off after this question.
Great.
I'm sorry to say. But, oh, there's somebody objecting? Yeah?
Yes.
Is that all right?
We're asking the last question.
Okay. I just wanted to follow up on what you said about financial instability, because I think that one thing that might help the lobby about banks is for people, Canadians, to realize what that means is that your investments and your pensions are not going to be any good.
Totally.
So if we actually made sure that all of the seniors and near seniors knew that, that would be a really important aspect in terms of the lobby. And so that leads to my last question, which is, given the political changes that we see may occur, it would appear to me that citizen action in Canada and also on the international stage will be affected, and we really need to be operating in Canada. But also, if the government doesn't help us get there, we're going to need to be asking civil society to make sure that we get there. Yeah. Can you just say any more about that before I say how
I
wonderful
feel
you
like
are?
you just said it.
Oh, okay. All right.
Guys, give it up for Susan. Isn't Susan the best?
I'd like to thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
I'm so delighted you managed to fit us in. I know you're exhausted, but I hope you got some energy from the support you have here, because you have done a fabulous description. Look at this,
Thanks, everyone.
and they're still awake, and they started at 8:30. So
I take that
it's really
compliment.
great. So thank you.
Thanks very much for having me. It's been wonderful to be here with you all.